Hello, and welcome to my professional studio and workshop.
It's okay that mine's not movie quality.
Don't mind the race car behind me. I like to park it in here just because I can. Anyway, in today's video, I'm going to be putting some tubes into this little amp. As you can see, this is an Orange Dark Terror, and a few weeks ago I was playing it and I had some excessive noise, like buzzing and humming, a lot like 60 cycle hum, but like on steroids. And I continued to play through that, and eventually the volume started to like swell up and down, but going lower and lower each time. It was kind of erratic, and I ended up having no control over the volume at all, and it was just barely audible at one point. And I was still able to like increase the gain and actually change the sound of the guitar, but I wasn't able to control the overall output of the guitar. So I concluded that the power tubes were going bad on this thing. So that's what we have here today. So the symptom that I already described to you, I'm not going to show you, at least not through this amp in the condition that it's in. I'm afraid if I turn it back on that I'll ruin something else with it. And I encourage you that if you're having tube problems, turn your amp off. You don't want to break anything else. If you try to play through bad tubes, you could end up ruining something worse. And tubes are really easy to replace, and other things maybe not so much. So I encourage you, if you're having problems, turn it off. Now, if you're only here to see how to change the tubes, you can skip forward until I start taking this thing apart. But if you want to know maybe some other symptoms that could mean you need to change your tubes, stick around, because I'll go through a few of those. Before I get into some of those symptoms, I'm just going to give a little backstory on this amp. I bought it a few years ago, used, and I'm not sure how the person before me played it. I'm not sure how hard they played it. I don't know if the tubes were already going bad, but I haven't played this amp that much, and the tubes are already bad. But to be fair, I actually don't play this head with an actual speaker connected very often. I do have a speaker, but most of the time I play this into a load box and a cab simulator with some headphones. Actually, these right here. So this is a Torpedo Captor 8 by 2 Notes and another 2 Notes. This is the Cab M. This is a cab simulator. This is a load box, by the way, in case you didn't get that. Highly recommend these if you don't want to play through speakers or you want to play through headphones. These are great. Can't recommend them enough. Anyway, one of the benefits to playing through something like that with headphones on is that you can absolutely crank your amp and no one will ever know. The downside to that is that you're going to burn through your tubes faster. The harder that you work those tubes, the harder that you crank your amp, the faster that you're going to burn through them. So you might be wondering then, well, how long do tubes last? And well, it kind of varies. If you don't play your amp that much, or if you use it gently, like maybe you're not cranking it all the time, maybe it's a secondary amp that you don't really touch all that often, the tubes could last a really long time. But if you're using it regularly and you like to crank it like I do, you might get a year or two out of them. It really just depends. So most likely, because of the way that I use this amp, I burn the tubes out. So what are the symptoms of tubes going bad? Well, there's what's happening to me, where I get erratic changes in volume, overall lower output, and excessive buzzing and humming. But that excessive noise could also be hiss. So just some things to pay attention to if you're looking for noise as the reason why your tubes might be going bad. Another symptom could be loss of high end, or like a muddy low end where it maybe sounds like too much bass, and overall like no clarity. I know sometimes that's kind of hard to tell, but if you maybe have a reference of what your amp should sound like I know this amp used to sound better and now it sounds really unclear and muddy and there's no high end to it, then it's probably your tubes going bad. Another symptom is if the fuse, where is it? Right here. If the fuse on your amp blows, that can be an indicator that your tubes are going bad too. A lot of times the fuses will blow as the tubes go bad to avoid more damage to the rest of the amp, and hopefully it will limit the damage. Another way to tell is by looking at the tubes themselves. So I'll take one out right here. So if you'll notice, there is a screen print on the tubes. Pretty much all of them are going to have something like that on it. If you notice that they're discolored, that probably means that the tube ran too hot and might need to be replaced. So check out the screen printing on them and make sure that they still look the way they're supposed to. Another way to tell is to take the tube, give it a little shake. If you hear it rattling, could be bad. The last reason that I'll give you is that your amp just flat out doesn't work. At that point, like, hopefully it's just a tube. It could be worse, but if it's not working, maybe check the tubes first. I will recommend to you though, to take it to a technician if it's not working, especially if you don't know what you're doing, like if you don't know what you're looking for. Tubes are expensive. I mean, for these two tubes right here, I paid $70. I mean, maybe I'm not looking in the right places for tubes, but I paid $70 for these. So you can imagine if you went through and replaced all the tubes in your amp, you could be looking at a couple $100s or more, and it might not even be the problem. So if your amp's just not working, consider taking it to a technician first and get it diagnosed and see if anything else is wrong with it. And I'm sure if it's already there, a technician can just easily swap tubes. So changing tubes is actually really simple. Most of the time you need to change like for like tubes, meaning if you have EL84 power tubes, you need to replace it with EL84 power tubes. If you have 6L6s, you'll want to replace it with 6L6s, and so on. All right, so to get to the tubes, I'm gonna have to remove the top of this head. Now, some heads or some amps, you don't have to do that. Sometimes you can actually just see them in the back of the amp and you can just reach up and pull them out. In this case, they're covered up by this thing, so I'm gonna have to unscrew it so we can expose them. So I have the screws off. First thing is definitely have the amp turned off and unplugged for this. This is gonna sound a little dramatic because most of the time that's a pretty simple process. But if you can, wait days to do this. I actually haven't turned this amp on in weeks because when it had the problems, I shut it off and I haven't turned it back on until, once I put the tubes in, I'll turn it back on. But, hopefully you've done the same where your amp has just been off until you're getting your new tubes. The reason I say this is because amps store a lot of power. And if you touch the wrong thing, you could electrocute yourself. So take precautions, be careful. I mean, tubes are really easy to replace, and as long as you're not touching all over the place, you should be fine. So that's why I say it's a little bit dramatic, but just in case, if you've never done this before, play it safe. Here we go. It looks so simple, doesn't it? It looks like there's nothing to it, but actually all the complex wiring is inside this container here. But from the top, these right here, at least in the case of this amp, these are the preamp tubes. This is a rectifier tube, and these back here are actually going to be the ones that we're after. These are the power tubes. So these are the three preamp tubes. They're 12AX7s. If you wanted to remove these on this amp, all you have to do is push these cylinders down and then turn it to the left, lefty-loosey, and pull up. There it is. All these work the same, including this one here. This is, like I said, the rectifier tube. On this amp, it's a 12AT7, I believe. Now onto the power tubes. You can see these are much simpler here. It just has these little spring-loaded gadgets here that hold down the tubes, and all we have to do is lift them up and wiggle the tubes out. Well, I can't believe it. I fully put this thing together and realized that my camera didn't record like the last 20 minutes of this. So I had to take it back apart, put the old tubes back in it, just so I could show you how I do this. It's one of those things where like you hear people talk about it and then you're like, oh man, that's too bad that happened to you. Now I'm one of those people. So hopefully if I'm doing this right, where I left you off, I was just about to take off the power tubes. So let me zoom back in for you. So these doohickeys right here are just little spring-loaded things that hold the tubes in. They just lift up and over the tubes so that you can pull them out. So let's go ahead and do that. then from there, to get the tubes out, we're just gonna gently kind of wiggle these things up and out. Again, gently, because you don't want to break off the pins that are on the bottom of these things. You don't want to break them off inside your amp, then you have big problems. So we're just gonna gently wiggle these things out. And that's it. The one thing to take note of with tubes is that they have a specific way that they go on. And if you look here, you'll notice that this top one right here is missing, right? There's a pattern to it. Just like on the tube, there's one right here, one little spot right here that doesn't have a hole for a pin to go through. So just make sure that when you put the tube in, that you follow this same pattern. Last thing you want to do is break one of the pins off of your new tube or break off a pin in your amp. As I mentioned before, you'll have some serious problems if you do that. So just be careful when you put them in, and we're also going to put them in very gently, like so. So as you put it down, just kind of verify that all the pins are going into their respective slots before you begin to put any kind of pressure. And then once they're where they need to be, you just kind of wiggle it in. A little bit of downward pressure and just kind of rock it back and forth until it settles all the way to the bottom. And that's it. Repeat the process for this guy here. Make sure all the pins are lined up before you put any pressure. And we're gonna wiggle it down. And then we're just gonna finish that off by putting these back over the top. And that's it. So that's all there is to it for this amp. It's really simple. I mentioned earlier biasing. So for this particular amp, this amp does not have to be biased. It has a cathode bias, which it kind of means that it's done automatically, right? So basically you throw a matched pair. That's another thing too. I didn't mention that before. You notice there's two tubes that we put in, obviously. These are a matched pair. You can buy them individually, but unless your amp doesn't specify that it needs a matched pair, I would say get a matched pair. If you're putting them in twos or fours, you should get a matched pair. They cost a little bit more that way, but you're best to do it that way. And again, throwing a matched pair in this amp, because it's cathode biased, means I don't have to bias it, means I can do this very easily, and I mean, essentially I'm done right now. Your amp might not be that way. You may need to have your amp biased. And if you don't know what you're doing there, I would highly suggest taking it to a technician so that they can bias it for you. So with that being said, this one's done. All I have to do is throw the cage back on top of it, and hopefully it works. this time? Yeah, that's right. Motherfucker.